If one decision in January 1945 had gone differently, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers would have crossed the Rhine under British command, and the political balance of the Allied war effort might have fractured before Germany collapsed. That decision was not made on the battlefield. It was made in a headquarters room thick with anger, wounded pride, and the threat of resignation. At the center of it stood Dwight D. Eisenhower. Opposite him stood a man who had just humiliated the American army in public and expected to be rewarded for it, Bernard Montgomery. The crisis did not begin with German tanks, it began with words. In early January 1945, the Allied armies had just survived the Battle of the Bulge. Over 80,000 American casualties had been taken in less than 6 weeks. Entire divisions had been chewed apart in the Ardennes. The front had bent, but it had not broken. The Americans had held, and they had paid for it. Then Montgomery held a press conference. Standing before reporters, Montgomery described the Bulge as a battle he had personally taken control of. He implied that American forces had been rescued from disaster by British leadership. He framed the crisis as one that required his intervention to stabilize an otherwise faltering front. The words traveled faster than artillery shells. Within hours, American officers were furious. Within days, senior U.S. generals were threatening resignation. George S. Patton Jr. was incandescent. Omar Bradley considered the remarks an unforgivable insult to soldiers who had just bled to hold the line. This was not about ego alone, it was about command legitimacy. Eisenhower now faced an internal crisis more dangerous than any German counteroffensive. He could not publicly rebuke Montgomery without shattering British confidence in Allied unity. He could not reward Montgomery without destroying American trust in the chain of command. And he could not ignore the problem because it was already tearing his headquarters apart. Behind closed doors, the stakes were clear. The British wanted more operational control. Montgomery wanted proof that his influence was growing, not shrinking. American generals wanted reassurance that their armies would not be subordinated to a man who had just questioned their competence before the world. Eisenhower's room for maneuver was narrow. He needed a solution that looked like concession, felt like punishment, and functioned as containment. The answer would involve soldiers, not speeches. At the time, the Allied front in Northwest Europe stretched over 450 miles. More than 4 million Allied troops were deployed. Of those, roughly 1.5 million were American. The largest single concentration sat north of the Ardennes, preparing for the final push into Germany. One formation stood at the center of the dilemma, the U.S. Ninth Army. Nearly 300,000 American soldiers, fully equipped, combat-tested, positioned directly opposite the Rhine. Montgomery wanted it. Not permanently, not officially, but for the next operation. The Rhine crossing was coming. It would be the most complex river assault in modern warfare. Thousands of boats, tens of thousands of engineers, massive air and artillery support. Whoever controlled that operation would shape the narrative of victory in the West. Montgomery argued that unity of command required him to control all ground forces north of the Ardennes. He framed it as efficiency, as clarity, as necessity. Eisenhower knew what it was: power. This was not the first time Montgomery had pressed for greater authority. Throughout 1944, he had argued for a single, narrow thrust into Germany under his command. American commanders had argued for a broad front advance. Eisenhower had sided with the Americans repeatedly. Each time, Montgomery complied. Each time, he remembered. Now, after the Bulge, Montgomery believed the moment had arrived. Eisenhower delayed his decision, not from indecision, but calculation. He listened to his generals, he read reports, he measured the consequences. If he stripped Montgomery of influence, British cooperation could fracture. If he gave Montgomery permanent control of an American army, the U.S. command structure could implode. There was no clean outcome, only controlled damage. The solution Eisenhower began to shape was temporary, conditional, precise. Montgomery would receive command of the U.S. Ninth Army for one operation only, the Rhine crossing. Nothing beyond it, no extensions, no reinterpretations, no exceptions. And when the river was crossed, the Army would return to American control. Montgomery was informed. He did not protest immediately. He understood the alternative. Refusal would isolate him. Acceptance would at least place him at the center of the next great operation. He agreed. Publicly, the alliance appeared intact. Privately, the fuse was lit. Because Eisenhower had not just lent Montgomery an army, he had drawn a line, and both men knew it. What followed exposed a pattern that Eisenhower had seen before and that he no longer trusted. Montgomery's command style relied on delay presented as caution. He demanded overwhelming superiority before movement. He insisted on perfect preparation. In North Africa, that approach had limited losses. In Normandy, it had slowed momentum. In the winter of 1944, with Germany already bleeding, it threatened to cost lives through time. The Rhine crossing was scheduled for March 1945, Operation Plunder. More than 1.25 million Allied troops would be involved across multiple army groups. Montgomery's sector alone would include over 30 divisions. Artillery concentrations exceeded 5,500 guns. Air support would involve more than 11,000 sorties in the opening phase. Under Montgomery's control sat the U.S. Ninth Army, commanded by William Hood Simpson. Nearly 300,000 American soldiers, 15 divisions, engineers, armor, logistics, all American. They would now answer, temporarily, to a British field marshal who had just questioned American competence in public. Eisenhower watched closely. The first warning sign came with tempo. Montgomery delayed movement to refine plans that were already sufficient. Timetables slipped by days, then by weeks. Each delay allowed German forces west of the Rhine to withdraw in better order. Every extra day meant fewer prisoners and more resistance on the far bank. American commanders noticed. Bradley complained privately that momentum was being sacrificed for ceremony. Patton, advancing south of the Ardennes, crossed the Rhine on March 22 with a surprise assault near Oppenheim, using fewer resources and accepting calculated risk. Montgomery was still preparing. The contrast was unmistakable. Under Montgomery, the Ninth Army was not mishandled tactically. It was restrained strategically. American divisions that had proven capable of rapid exploitation were ordered to wait. Artillery plans were expanded beyond necessity. Engineer units sat idle while German rear guards escaped. Casualties did not spike immediately. That was the illusion. The cost appeared in April. By the time Montgomery launched his set-piece crossing on March 23rd, German forces had already evacuated thousands of troops and significant equipment east of the Rhine. Resistance on the far bank stiffened. Urban fighting increased. Urban towns that could have been seized lightly now required deliberate assaults. Between late March and mid-April 1945, U.S. Ninth Army suffered over 12,000 casualties in operations that American commanders believed could have been shortened by weeks. Not because the crossing failed, it succeeded, but because exploitation was delayed. This was the core of Eisenhower's concern. Montgomery's method reduced immediate risk while increasing cumulative cost. Fewer losses on day 1, more losses by day 20. The pattern repeated in command behavior. Montgomery issued orders directly to American Corps commanders, bypassing Simpson. He framed them as clarifications. Eisenhower saw them as boundary testing. Each order pushed slightly further than the last. Each assumed continued authority beyond the agreed scope. Behind the scenes, Montgomery began arguing that operational necessity required his continued control of the Ninth Army after the Rhine. The German collapse, he claimed, demanded unity of command through the final drive. Handing the army back now would create confusion. Eisenhower heard the argument. He'd heard versions of it before. What Montgomery underestimated was that Eisenhower had already calculated the cost, not just in casualties, but in alliance cohesion. The American generals had accepted temporary subordination under protest. Permanent loss of control would not be tolerated. By early April, the Rhine had been crossed. The condition had been met. Montgomery pressed anyway. He requested extensions. Then he delayed the formal transfer. Then he argued that the transfer should wait until Berlin fell. Each request was framed as operational logic. Eisenhower read it as ambition. This was the escalation point. The same pattern that had nearly fractured Allied command after the bulge was repeating itself. Public confidence masked private strain. American officers watched closely to see if Eisenhower would enforce his word or yield to pressure for harmony. If he yielded, the message would be clear. American armies could be reassigned at British convenience. If he enforced the agreement, the alliance would survive, but Montgomery would be checked. The decision could no longer be postponed, and this time it would not be disguised as compromise. The decision was executed without ceremony, and that was deliberate. On April 4, 1945, Dwight Eisenhower issued the order returning the U.S. Ninth Army to American control. No negotiation, no extension, no ambiguity. Montgomery's authority ended exactly where Eisenhower had said it would end, at the Rhine. Nearly 300,000 American soldiers were reassigned in a single stroke. Montgomery protested. He argued that the final advance into Germany required continuity. He warned that breaking command unity would slow the collapse of German resistance. He framed the issue as efficiency. Eisenhower did not engage the argument. He enforced the agreement. What was taken away was not just an army, it was leverage. Montgomery had believed that success at the Rhine would make the transfer politically impossible to reverse. He was wrong. Eisenhower understood that allowing Montgomery to retain control would signal weakness to his own commanders. Worse, it would validate the behavior that had caused the crisis in January. The immediate impact was visible within days. Once returned to American command under Omar Bradley, the Ninth Army accelerated. Exploitation orders replaced consolidation orders. Advances measured in miles per day resumed. German units were overrun before they could establish new defensive lines. Prisoner counts surged. Resistance collapsed unevenly, then completely. The contrast was not subtle. In the final month of the war, American armies advanced deeper and faster than any Allied force in Europe. The difference was not manpower, it was command philosophy. Risk was accepted. Time was treated as a weapon. Delay was recognized as cost. The Rhine crossing itself had succeeded, but the delay surrounding it had consequences. German units that escaped in March fought in April. Towns not seized quickly had to be cleared room by room. Each additional day of war meant additional casualties. Those casualties were not theoretical. Between the Rhine and the Elbe, thousands of American soldiers were killed or wounded, fighting units that could have been trapped west of the river. Eisenhower understood that responsibility. It was why the decision in January had been so narrow, and why the correction in April was absolute. He did not strip Montgomery of the Ninth Army out of spite. He did it to prevent precedent, to protect command integrity, and to stop ego from dictating tempo. The alliance held because the boundary was enforced. Montgomery never again commanded an American army. The war ended weeks later. The rupture that nearly occurred in January was avoided, not through diplomacy alone, but through a precise, limited concession followed by decisive reversal. This is the cost of leadership failure measured in time, not dramatic collapse, not betrayal, but delay that allows men to die after victory is already inevitable. Eisenhower's decision did not erase those losses, it acknowledged them. It drew a line where one had to be drawn, and it proved that alliances survive not by indulging ego, but by containing it, before unnecessary casualties become the final price. The consequences of the decision became visible not in communiques, but in behavior. Within days of the Ninth Army's return to American control, the atmosphere inside Allied headquarters shifted. The resignation threats that had circulated quietly in January vanished. American Corps commanders no longer questioned whether their authority could be overridden by political necessity. Orders moved faster, arguments shortened. Trust, strained for months, stabilized. This mattered because the war was not over yet. In early April 1945, German resistance did not collapse uniformly. Isolated pockets fought on. Fanatical units defended river lines, factory towns, and road junctions long after defeat was inevitable. Every delay and exploitation allowed these units to reorganize. Every pause translated into more firefights, more ambushes, more funerals. Under American command, the Ninth Army advanced at an average rate exceeding 10 miles per day. In some sectors, armored columns covered 20 miles in 24 hours. German formations were bypassed, surrounded, and forced to surrender without prolonged fighting. Prisoner counts rose into the tens of thousands. Resistance disintegrated unevenly, then rapidly. This acceleration shortened the war in the Ninth Army's sector by days. Not weeks, days. And days mattered. A single day of combat in April 1945 could still cost hundreds of American casualties. Mines, snipers, artillery fire from units that would surrender the following morning. Each unnecessary day preserved danger that no longer served a strategic purpose. Eisenhower understood this arithmetic. He had always understood it. His restraint in January was not weakness, it was calculation. He absorbed insult to preserve alliance cohesion. He accepted temporary subordination of American troops to avoid rupture, but he never surrendered ultimate control. The line was drawn in advance, and when it was crossed, he enforced it without hesitation. Montgomery never publicly challenged the decision again. He understood the message. The alliance was not a platform for personal authority. It was a structure held together by limits. The broader lesson extended beyond personalities. Coalition warfare magnified ego, but it punished delay. The Americans had learned this lesson in blood at Kasserine. Eisenhower applied it in command space in 1945. Leadership failure does not always announce itself as disaster. Sometimes it appears as caution stretched too far, as pride allowed to linger, as days added to a war already won. By stripping Montgomery of the Ninth Army exactly when he said he would, Eisenhower demonstrated that credibility in war is enforced, not implied, that promises matter, and that the cost of not enforcing them is measured in lives that do not need to be lost. That is why the decision mattered, not because it humiliated a British field marshal, but because it prevented the final weeks of the war from becoming longer, bloodier, and more pointless than they already were. What followed in the final weeks of the war confirmed why Eisenhower's boundary mattered. As American armies pushed deeper into Germany, differences in command philosophy became measurable. U.S. forces emphasized speed over symmetry. Objectives were prioritized, not perfected. Towns were bypassed when resistance was light, isolated when resistance was heavy, and reduced later by infantry rather than armor. The goal was collapse, not elegance. This contrasted sharply with Montgomery's preferred method. His operations favored set-piece battles, clear lines, and deliberate consolidation. That approach minimized surprise but extended contact. In April 1945, extended contact meant extended casualties. German units that would surrender tomorrow could still kill today. American after-action reports from mid-April show a consistent pattern. Rapid advances reduced firefights. Faster encirclements produced mass surrenders. Shorter engagements meant fewer wounded evacuated and fewer names added to casualty lists. These were not abstract benefits, they were recorded outcomes. Eisenhower saw this as validation. He had not stripped Montgomery of authority to assert national pride. He had done it to restore operational tempo at the exact moment tempo saved lives. The war was already decided strategically. What remained was the cost of execution. By April 20th, American forces were approaching the Elbe. Command had fractured. Supply lines were gone. Air cover was non-existent. Yet resistance continued in pockets because it had time to do so. Where that time was denied, resistance collapsed almost immediately. This is where leadership decisions become lethal or merciful. Every additional day of command friction risked slowing momentum. Every hesitation risked turning surrender into firefight. Eisenhower's enforcement removed ambiguity. American commanders knew who they answered to. British commanders knew the limits. The system stabilized. Montgomery retained his prestige. He retained his army group. What he lost was the ability to redefine agreements through pressure. Eisenhower retained something more important: credibility with the men doing the fighting. The final casualty figures of the European war are often discussed as inevitabilities. They were not. Many were the result of time mismanaged, not battles misfought. Eisenhower's decision did not erase loss, but it reduced its tail. This is the quiet burden of supreme command. Not choosing between victory and defeat, but between faster victory and slower victory, between days and weeks, between men who go home and men who do not. That is why the decision to take back 300,000 American soldiers mattered, not as an insult to Bernard Montgomery, but as a safeguard for soldiers whose lives depended on momentum more than ceremony. And it is why Dwight Eisenhower enforced the line when the war was almost won, because that is when unnecessary deaths are easiest to justify and hardest to defend.